The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows over a city that used to be bustling with life. Now, only echoes of what once was remained, empty streets, shattered windows, and the relentless moaning of the undead. They wandered aimlessly, their decayed bodies almost unrecognizable as human, their hunger driving them forward in search of something they could no longer satisfy. The world had changed. The world had ended. In the heart of the city stood a solitary figure, Adam. He had been a survivor since the beginning of the outbreak, his face hardened by loss and his eyes sharpened by necessity. His body was covered in dirt and his clothes tattered from the many encounters with the undead. Adam had learned how to survive in this new, dangerous world, but the truth was, even he didn't know how long he could last. The food was dwindling, and hope was a scarce resource. Days had turned into weeks, weeks into months, and during that time, Adam had seen the world he once knew slowly collapse. The government had fallen, the cities had been overrun, and society had crumbled. But most shocking of all was the way the undead had changed. No longer the mindless, slow-moving creatures that simply tore into anything alive, they had become something worse, starving husks, driven by a hunger that could never be satisfied. It had started with reports of zombies growing weaker, their movements more sluggish, their eyes less vacant. At first, no one understood why. Theories were thrown around. Was it the virus mutating? Was it some kind of new mutation in the zombies' biology? But Adam knew better. He had seen it firsthand. The undead were hungry, yes, but they were also dying. The virus that had turned them into monsters was not just consuming the living, it was consuming them too. Their hunger was endless, but the resources they relied on, living flesh, were becoming scarce. The few survivors who remained had learned how to hide, how to blend in, and how to fight back, but those methods only delayed the inevitable. The undead would eventually starve, their bodies too weak to keep moving, too broken to hunt. Adam's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a distant groan. He crouched behind a burned-out car, his breath steady, his grip tight on the rifle he had scavenged days earlier. Through the smoky haze, he spotted a lone zombie stumbling down the street. Its skin was peeling, its bones visible through the thin layers of rotting flesh. It was moving slower than usual, its groaning more a rasp than a full-throated roar. The zombie paused, swaying for a moment, and then collapsed onto the cracked pavement. Its limbs twitched in spasms as if the hunger inside it was consuming what little life it had left. Adam watched, his pulse quickening. This was a sight he'd grown familiar with over the past few weeks. The undead had started dying from starvation, their bodies unable to process the hunger anymore. The realization hit Adam hard. The virus didn't just destroy the living, it destroyed everything. There was no hope for a cure. There was no hope for a return to normal. The survivors like Adam were the last remnants of humanity, left to struggle in a world where the living were scarce, and the undead were on their last legs. As Adam made his way through the abandoned city, he couldn't help but wonder if he was seeing the end of the apocalypse, the slow, painful death of the very creatures that had brought humanity to its knees. Would they starve to death, or was there something else at play here? No matter the answer, the world as he knew it was gone. The apocalypse had left only echoes. But Adam couldn't stop. Not yet. He still had to survive. There were still places where the undead roamed in packs, and he couldn't afford to be caught off guard. With each step, the memories of his family, their faces, their voices, began to fade. It was as if the hunger that had consumed the world had also consumed his ability to remember. But it wasn't just the undead who were losing themselves. The survivors, too, were beginning to lose everything they had once held dear. Hope was a distant memory, and trust was a fragile thing, shattered by betrayal and the constant fight to survive. The world around Adam was dying, and so were the creatures that had nearly wiped out humanity. The undead's hunger had become their curse. They could never be satisfied, and they would never stop seeking what they craved. But in their relentless pursuit of that hunger, they were killing themselves. As the day wore on and the sun began to dip below the horizon, Adam found a small shelter, a crumbling building that once housed a convenience store. Inside, he carefully scanned the shelves. The food was nearly gone, the cans rusted from neglect, but there were still a few left. He grabbed what he could, knowing that every meal was one step closer to the end. But the hunger of the undead was not finished. And neither, it seemed, was Adam. Adam sat in the dim light of the convenience store, eating the last of a can of beans. The taste was stale, the texture even worse, but it was nourishment, and in this broken world, nourishment was a luxury. He leaned back against the crumbling wall, wiping the remnants of food from his mouth with the back of his hand. His mind was heavy with thoughts of what had happened, the rapid collapse of society, the sickness that turned people into the very creatures that now roamed the earth, and now, the slow death of the undead. He had learned something important in these last few months. The zombies weren't just mindless monsters. No, they were evolving, in a way. Or, perhaps more accurately, they were de-evolving. Their once insatiable hunger had become a curse. At first, it had been as simple as eating. They would hunt, devour, and move on. But now, it was different. They were starving, dying of their own hunger. The shift had been subtle, something that had gone unnoticed by many of the other survivors. People were too focused on escaping the hordes, avoiding bites, and fighting for shelter to notice the slow and gradual decay of the zombies themselves. But Adam had seen it. He had been one of the first to observe how the creatures that once filled the streets, relentless in their pursuit of the living, had grown weaker and weaker. At first, he had assumed it was just a natural consequence of the virus. Maybe it was weakening, causing the zombies to lose their stamina. But as the weeks passed, Adam began to realize the truth. The hunger was consuming them from the inside out. Their bodies were deteriorating faster than they could hunt, and there was nothing left to sustain them. Adam set the empty can down on the floor and stood up, his joints aching from the long days of running, hiding, and scavenging. His mind flashed back to the last group of survivors he had met, a small band of people who had managed to hold out in a nearby apartment complex. They had been hopeful, desperate even, believing they could ride out the apocalypse and wait for some kind of rescue. But as the days wore on, they began to change. Tensions ran high, and trust began to fray. People were no longer thinking clearly, they were too hungry, too afraid. The constant threat of zombies outside their walls made even the simplest decisions feel like life and death choices. It was during one of these moments of desperation that Adam had realized the truth about the undead. They weren't invincible. They weren't unstoppable. They were dying, just like everything else in this world. And as much as it pained him to admit it, he had seen a glimpse of hope. He made his way to the broken window at the front of the store and peered outside. The streets were eerily quiet. No zombies in sight. He knew better than to let his guard down, but for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to relax for just a moment. The silence felt almost unnatural, as if the city had been abandoned for far longer than he realized. His thoughts turned to the survivors he had met over the past few months, those who had joined him for a brief time, only to fall victim to the horde, or worse, to the hunger that had driven them mad. Most people had given up long ago, but Adam still clung to the hope that there was a way to survive this, perhaps even to rebuild. The zombies' hunger had turned against them, and Adam had seen firsthand how it weakened them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding out what came next. Was this the end? Or was it possible that the world could be saved from the depths of this nightmare? Suddenly, a noise broke his thoughts, a low, dragging sound, like something heavy scraping against concrete. Adam froze. His heart raced as his eyes darted to the door. There was something out there. Something undead. He grabbed his rifle from the corner and moved toward the back of the store, hoping to avoid detection. The sound grew louder. It was drawing closer. Adam knew he had to stay hidden. His chances of survival were slim if he was caught out in the open. He pressed himself against the wall, listening intently, waiting for the undead to pass. But then, something strange happened. The dragging sound stopped. Adam held his breath, straining to hear any movement. His hand tightened on his rifle. He dared not make a sound, but curiosity gnawed at him. Was it another survivor? Or was it just another zombie, weak and dying like the others. He peeked around the corner of the shelf, just in time to see a lone zombie stumble into the alleyway outside. It was the same as the others he had seen, worn out, frail, and unsteady. It had clearly been walking for hours, maybe days, and now it was faltering, as if its body had finally given up. It collapsed against a dumpster, its rotting body unable to hold itself upright any longer. The sight of it was unsettling, not just because of the decay, but because Adam felt something stir within him. Sympathy. The zombie wasn't a mindless predator anymore. It was just a victim of its own insatiable hunger, a hunger that had no end. A hunger that was now killing it. Adam stared at the creature for a long moment, the realization settling in his chest. This wasn't just a world full of survivors and zombies. This was a world where even the undead were running out of time. The hunger had destroyed them, just as it had destroyed so much of humanity. But it wasn't over yet. There was still something left. And Adam would fight to the end to see what that was. The days blurred into one another, a never-ending cycle of scavenging, hiding, and surviving. Adam had become numb to the reality around him, the twisted streets, the rotting corpses that once had been people, the constant tension that clung to every corner. The slow decay of the undead had become something almost expected. Every time he crossed paths with them, he found them weaker, slower, and more desperate. What had once been a terrifying force of nature, an unstoppable army, had become a shadow of itself. The realization that the zombies were dying of hunger was no longer a theory. It was a fact. Adam had seen it up close too many times. Their bodies were wasting away. Their movements had become erratic, sluggish, as though the hunger inside them was devouring them from the inside out. It was like a cruel irony, what had once made them so dangerous, their unrelenting drive for flesh, had become their undoing. One afternoon, Adam found himself in the ruins of a supermarket, carefully navigating through aisles that had long since been emptied of food. The only things left were broken shelves, shattered glass, and a smell that had long since crossed from stale to unbearable. He had heard rumors of other survivors living in a nearby safe zone, but those were only whispers now. Every time he thought of finding them, something in his gut told him it might be a trap, a cruel mirage. Trust had become as rare as food in this world. Adam's mind wandered back to the first days after the outbreak. The fear had been palpable, the world still in shock, scrambling for answers. It hadn't been long before the true horror of the virus was understood, that it wasn't just turning people into zombies, it was warping them, pushing them into an endless cycle of hunger. For months, the undead had been relentless, as if there was no end to their appetite. But now, that very hunger was their downfall. He crouched beside a pile of overturned cans, surveying the room. A sharp noise echoed from the back of the store, a dragging sound again. The zombies hadn't learned to avoid sound, to avoid being detected. They had lost that sharpness, that primal instinct that once allowed them to hunt with precision. Their hunger was too overpowering, too consuming, and now it was killing them slowly. Adam moved quietly toward the back, the sound growing louder. His heart thumped in his chest, but this time, he didn't feel fear. He felt a strange kind of pity for what he might find. The undead had once been unstoppable, and now, they were broken, like the rest of the world. As he rounded the corner, he saw it. A zombie lay on the floor, its skin a sickly greenish hue, the flesh hanging off its bones in chunks. It was twitching spasmodically, its skeletal hands clawing at the floor as if trying to drag itself forward. The groans were almost weak now, little more than a rasp, as if even its vocal cords were withering away. It looked almost pitiful, a far cry from the monsters that had once ruled the streets. Adam took a step forward, his rifle raised instinctively, but he hesitated. The zombie wasn't even looking for food anymore. It was just trying to survive, if only for a little longer. Its hunger was endless, but its body had become incapable of satisfying it. The creature had become nothing more than an echo of the terror it once represented, a ghost of hunger. Adam couldn't shake the thought. Were all the zombies like this now? Were they all dying of starvation? He had heard whispers of it from other survivors, but until now, he hadn't seen it firsthand. It was a cruel twist of fate. The virus had turned them into monsters, yes, but it was the very nature of their existence, their hunger, that had become their undoing. He stayed still for a moment longer, watching the zombie struggle. There was nothing he could do for it. No mercy could be given to a creature that no longer had a soul, no longer had the capacity for anything but hunger. Still, the sight of its feeble movements stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A part of him wondered, was this the end of the undead? Would they all simply die out, unable to continue their cycle of destruction? Or was there something else? Some other force that would ensure the monsters would endure, even in their broken state? Adam shook his head, pushing the thought away. The world had already shown him that answers were hard to come by. Survival was what mattered now, not the mysteries of the undead's origins or their inevitable end. He turned and moved back toward the entrance of the supermarket, cautiously glancing over his shoulder at the zombie, which was still struggling on the floor. It hadn't moved much since he'd last seen it. It was as though the creature knew, on some primal level, that its time was up. It would never eat again. It would never hunt again. Adam stepped out into the daylight, his eyes scanning the desolate street before him. The world outside was still as silent as ever, save for the occasional groan or shuffle of a dying zombie. It was hard to imagine that this was the same world that had once been full of life, full of cities, full of people, full of noise. Now, it was just ruins, an empty shell of what had once been. But in that silence, Adam found something. A strange kind of peace, mixed with the horror of what had been lost. The undead had been the scourge of the world, but now they were fading, like everything else. And in their fading, something new was taking shape, something Adam could still hold on to. The last bite had never come for them. But for Adam, survival was still a daily fight. And he would continue, no matter what. Adam's footsteps echoed through the empty streets, the sounds muffled by the thick layer of dust that had settled over everything. The city had become a graveyard, silent, forgotten, and decaying. A far cry from the vibrant place it had once been. Now, all that remained were broken windows, abandoned vehicles, and the occasional distant groan from a weakened zombie. The hunger of the undead had become an epidemic in itself, spreading through the ranks of the creatures like a slow poison. They were no longer the ravenous predators they had once been, stalking anything with a heartbeat. Their movements were sluggish, their steps unsteady, their once insatiable appetites now tempered by their own bodies betraying them. The zombies Adam encountered now were shadows of their former selves, less dangerous, but just as relentless. They still moved with a purpose, but their purpose had become a futile chase. The hunger inside them was endless, but their bodies were betraying them, slowing down to the point of collapse. Adam had seen it in the last few days, zombies too weak to run, too starved to hunt. They had become mere echoes of the terror they once brought. But even now, in their slow death, they were still a threat. The world they had once terrorized was now ruled by their decay. Adam stopped in the middle of the street, taking a moment to survey his surroundings. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The distant groaning of the undead was the only sound, a reminder that he was not alone in this empty world. The world had been ravaged by hunger, and not just the undead. The survivors, too, had begun to feel the weight of starvation. Food was scarce, supplies were dwindling, and hope seemed more fragile with each passing day. He had heard rumors of a safe zone to the north, a place where the last remnants of humanity had gathered to rebuild. It was a story repeated by every survivor he met, each one hoping, desperately, that it was true. Adam had hoped too, once. But now, after everything he had seen, he wasn't sure if such a place even existed anymore. The world had changed so completely that it was hard to imagine anything normal could survive. But then again, wasn't that the very definition of survival? Adapting to the new reality. The hunger that had ravaged the undead, the very thing that had started the apocalypse, was now a shadow of what it once was. And that gave Adam a small flicker of hope, a glimpse of a future where the undead might eventually vanish. His thoughts were interrupted by a noise behind him, a faint scraping sound. His body tensed, his fingers instinctively reaching for the rifle slung across his back. Slowly, he turned, scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. There, in the alleyway, a lone figure shuffled toward him. At first glance, it seemed to be one of the undead, its movements slow and jerky, its skin torn and decayed. But something was different. It wasn't as aggressive as the others. In fact, it seemed to be dragging itself, almost as if it were too weak to stand. Adam narrowed his eyes, his heart racing. It was another zombie, but it was different. This one wasn't mindlessly hunting. It was just trying to survive. As it got closer, Adam could see the extent of its decay. The bone was exposed in several places, and its flesh hung off its limbs in ragged strips. Its eyes, once glazed with hunger, now seemed distant, as though the creature was lost in a daze. Adam hesitated. He had learned the hard way that any sign of weakness in the undead could be a trap. A single misstep could end his life. But there was something about this one that made him pause. It wasn't acting with the same violent intent as the others. It was just existing. It seemed as if the hunger had consumed it completely, leaving it a shell of its former self. As it drew closer, Adam could hear the faint rasp of its breath, a sign that the creature was still alive, or at least something close to it. The thing that had once made zombies so terrifying, their relentless pursuit of flesh, was no longer the driving force. Instead, it was a hollow existence, just a lingering echo of what they had once been. The zombie stopped a few feet from Adam, its eyes meeting his. For a moment, there was a strange stillness between them. Adam felt a pang of pity, an emotion he hadn't expected to feel for something that had once been so deadly. But there it was, a recognition that the creature before him was more than just a monster. It was a victim of its own nature. Adam's hand remained on his rifle, his instincts still sharp, but he couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. There was nothing left to kill. This creature wasn't a threat anymore. It was just one of the many that had outlived their usefulness in the world. With a final, shuddering gasp, the zombie collapsed to the ground, its limbs twitching weakly. It was over. The hunger had consumed it. Adam watched for a long moment before turning away. He didn't know what to make of what he had just witnessed. The zombies had been the enemy, but now, it seemed as though they were dying in slow motion. Their hunger had torn them apart, and there was no way to stop it. The apocalypse wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about the slow death of everything, of the undead, of the old world, of humanity itself. The hunger that had destroyed it all had now turned in on itself, making the creatures it had created its own undoing. Adam kept moving forward. The city was quiet, the air thick with the scent of decay. But in the distance, he saw something, a flicker of movement. It wasn't a zombie. It wasn't a survivor. It was just a glimmer of light, a sign of something that could be. It wasn't much, but in a world so consumed by darkness, it was enough to keep him going. The hunger had destroyed the undead, but for Adam, it was just another obstacle to overcome. He had made it this far, he would keep moving, no matter what. Adam walked with the wind against his face, his shoes kicking up dust with every step. The air had a strange stillness to it, as if even the wind was afraid to move too quickly in this broken world. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the decimated city. He could hear the occasional scrape of a zombie's footstep or the distant groan that signified their dying hunger, but beyond that, there was nothing. The world, once full of vibrant life, now seemed like an abandoned painting, colors drained and forgotten. But even in the ruins, Adam couldn't escape the ever-present question gnawing at him: was there still a future for the living? Or had humanity's fight for survival simply become a slow march to extinction? He paused in front of a crumbled building, the remnants of what might have once been a hospital. The large red cross painted on the wall had faded over time, now barely visible under layers of grime and decay. There was no sign of life in the area, no movement. Just the sound of his breath and the distant moans of the undead that had lost their purpose. Survival had become a game of chances. Every turn could lead to death, and every choice felt like the final one. Yet, Adam pressed on. There were still rumors of survivors, whispers that refused to die, just like the hunger that had ravaged the world. It was these stories that had kept him moving, the faint hope that somewhere, someone had found a way to rebuild. Or maybe, it was a fantasy he clung to because the alternative, being truly alone, was unbearable. As he made his way through the wreckage, Adam's thoughts drifted back to the early days of the outbreak. It had all started so quickly, a virus sweeping across nations in the blink of an eye. At first, the world had fought back, governments scrambling to create vaccines, military forces trying to contain the chaos. But it was no use. The dead had risen, and the hunger had spread faster than any cure could be made. The undead were relentless in their pursuit of the living, and in that pursuit, they had infected the earth itself. The cities fell, one by one, as survivors either died or scattered to find safe havens. But there were only so many safe places left in a world where nothing was truly safe anymore. The safe zones that once offered hope were now fading memories, some of them overrun by the same slow-moving zombies Adam encountered. Others had been abandoned as their inhabitants succumbed to the hunger they had tried so hard to outrun. As he neared the broken front doors of the hospital, Adam hesitated. Something felt different today. The familiar groans of the zombies that had once filled him with dread now seemed almost hollow. They were weaker, more sluggish, their movements even more unpredictable than before. He could hear them stumbling, crashing into obstacles with more force than necessary, but there was no urgency in their steps anymore. They weren't hunting him. They were just existing. Adam pushed the door open slowly, the creaking hinges almost deafening in the silence of the city. The smell hit him first, musty, stale, with the faintest trace of rot. Inside, the halls were dimly lit, the remnants of old medical supplies scattered across the floor. Papers lay in heaps, and the air was thick with the dust of abandonment. He moved cautiously, rifle at the ready, though he didn't expect any immediate danger. The zombies weren't capable of much these days, their hunger eating away at their physicality, their movements breaking down as they slowly withered away. Adam turned the corner to find a hospital room, a strange sight in this desolate world. The walls were cracked, and the beds had been long stripped of any useful materials, but something caught his eye. The walls were covered in notes, hastily written in a language he couldn't immediately understand. It was a mix of scribbles, drawings, and calculations, most of it frantic and disjointed. He stepped closer to examine the walls, squinting at the words. One part of it caught his attention: the hunger is killing them from the inside out. There must be a way to stop it, but we are running out of time. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Someone had been researching the zombies, trying to understand the cause of their decay, but they had clearly failed. The hunger was always the enemy, but now, it seemed to be the very thing that was dismantling them. It was a strange irony: what had once made them invincible was now their greatest weakness. Suddenly, a soft noise broke his concentration. The unmistakable shuffle of footsteps. Adam froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't need to look to know what it was. There were still undead nearby. They hadn't all been wiped out, not yet. But these zombies didn't seem to be interested in him. Their movements were slow and disoriented, their groans more pathetic than threatening. They had become shells of their former selves, their hunger the only thing driving them forward, but even that was fading away. Adam crept further down the hallway, careful not to draw attention. There were more of them in the next room, their bodies twitching and jerking as they moved aimlessly, caught in an endless loop of searching for food that would never come. The thought of it was almost unbearable: these once fearsome creatures, reduced to nothing more than starving husks, wandering aimlessly. They had been unstoppable once, but now they were helpless. Adam's eyes scanned the room, lingering on one of the zombies, an old man with a long beard, his skin hanging loosely from his bones. His eyes locked with Adam's for a brief moment, a flash of recognition flickering across the decaying face. For a moment, Adam felt something, a connection, an acknowledgement of their shared fate. The man was no longer human, but in that instant, Adam saw a brief, tragic glimpse of what he had once been. A person, now reduced to hunger and decay. The zombie's eyes seemed to dull again, and it turned, continuing its search for food, leaving Adam alone in the quiet room. Adam exhaled slowly, his hand trembling slightly. He wasn't sure what to make of it. This world had changed so completely that nothing made sense anymore. The living were still clinging to survival, but the undead, once a terrifying force, had been reduced to a hollow, dying echo. And yet, in that death, in their slow starvation, there was a bitter hope. A future where the undead would eventually fade away. But what would be left after they were gone? Could humanity rebuild? Or was it too late? Adam didn't know the answer. But one thing was certain, he was still here. And for now, that was enough. Adam's journey had taken him farther than he ever imagined, yet with each step, the world around him seemed more and more unreal. What had once been a thriving civilization was now just a collection of broken memories, overrun by the remnants of a nightmare. The zombies that had once terrorized humanity now shuffled aimlessly through the streets, their hunger gone, their bodies rotting, moving only because they had no other choice. In the distance, Adam saw the faint outline of a building, an old library. The structure stood tall against the setting sun, its dark windows like hollow eyes staring out at him. It was a reminder of what had been lost, a place once filled with knowledge and possibility, now standing empty, just like everything else in the world. He walked toward it, the gravel beneath his boots crunching with every step. The further he went, the more he realized how isolated he felt. Even the wind, once a symbol of nature's power, had become a haunting presence, whispering through the dead trees and overturned cars. He had heard rumors of survivors further to the north, but each day the hope of finding them felt more like a dream, a fantasy he clung to simply to survive. The world had changed so drastically, it was hard to imagine that any human settlement could have survived, let alone thrived. Adam had seen enough abandoned safe zones to know that humanity's attempts to rebuild were often futile. As he neared the library, Adam couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't the usual sensation of being stalked by a zombie. This was different, quieter, more deliberate. He stopped for a moment, scanning the area. The street was empty, devoid of any movement. The only thing he could hear was the occasional rustle of paper in the wind. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, he pushed open the heavy door of the library. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty halls like a warning. Inside, the air was musty, thick with the scent of old books and dust. The walls were lined with shelves, most of them empty or knocked over. What remained of the books were yellowed with age, their pages brittle and torn. The library had been looted long ago, but it still felt like a sanctuary, a place that once held the power to educate, to inspire, to offer hope. Adam wandered through the aisles, his fingers brushing against the cracked spines of forgotten stories. Some of the books were about history, others about science, art, philosophy. It was almost tragic, these once precious treasures of knowledge now left to decay, much like the world outside. He moved deeper into the library, eventually finding a quiet corner where a faint light filtered through a crack in the roof. There, on the floor, was a journal, its cover worn and faded. Adam bent down to pick it up, his hands trembling as he turned the pages. The writing inside was cramped and hurried, the words clearly written by someone desperate to document what had happened. The hunger is killing them faster now. I can see it in their eyes. They don't even recognize us anymore. They're not the monsters they used to be. They're something else. The hunger has eaten away at them, and I fear it will consume us all before the end comes. The words sent a chill down Adam's spine. The writer's fear was palpable. It was clear that even in the early days of the outbreak, people had begun to understand that the undead weren't just mindless creatures, they were victims of a greater, unrelenting force. I don't know how much longer I can last. The others are getting weaker. The food is running out. And even though the undead seem less dangerous now, they are still here. They still exist. It feels like they're waiting for something, but I don't know what. Adam closed the journal with a heavy sigh. The writer had been right. The undead had changed, becoming weaker, slower, but not gone. Their hunger had destroyed their bodies, but not their will to exist. They were still here, still wandering the earth, and their presence was as unsettling as ever. But as Adam sat there, holding the journal, he realized something else. The hunger that had driven the undead for so long had also been the very thing that was destroying them. It was ironic in a way, what had once made them unstoppable, made them thrive, was now the source of their downfall. In a way, it was a grim reflection of humanity itself. The hunger for survival, the drive to dominate, had led to the destruction of civilization. But perhaps, in that destruction, there was an opportunity. An opportunity for something new, something different. Adam stood up, slipping the journal into his backpack. It was a small piece of history, but it might help him understand more about what had happened, and what was still happening. The world was far from over, and there was still much to learn. The library was silent once again, the only sound the faint rustling of papers in the wind. Adam stepped back outside, the fading light of the sun casting long shadows across the empty streets. He didn't know where his journey would take him next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like there might be a reason to keep going. The undead might be fading, but the hunger for answers, for understanding, still burned within him. And maybe, just maybe, the light that had been lost could be found again. The night had fallen silent, save for the occasional screech of a distant wind and the eerie shuffle of the undead somewhere beyond the horizon. Adam stood atop a crumbling building, looking out over the city as the moon cast long, jagged shadows across the broken streets below. The library had been a temporary sanctuary, a brief respite from the relentless loneliness that had haunted him for so long. Yet, despite the quiet comfort he had found in its dusty pages and long-forgotten knowledge, Adam knew he could not stay. The world outside still held too many unanswered questions, too many mysteries yet to be unraveled. He took one last look at the city, the place he had once called home. Now it was a shell of its former self, with nothing but the ruins of civilization remaining. Yet, as he stood there, amidst the stillness and decay, he realized that the hunger that had destroyed everything, both the living and the dead, was not the end. It was only the beginning of something new. The moonlight illuminated a distant structure. What was once a large factory now lay in ruins, but there was still a flicker of life, faint but unmistakable. A sign of movement. For the first time in what felt like forever, Adam felt a spark of hope stir within him. There were survivors out there. He knew it. If he could just reach them, perhaps there was a chance to rebuild. But the road to them would not be easy. The undead, though weakened, still wandered the streets aimlessly, and even if their hunger had lessened, their presence was no less dangerous. The world was a fragile place, and any misstep could be fatal. Adam pulled his pack tighter around his shoulders, adjusting his rifle. He had been on the move for what felt like a lifetime, but this was different. This time, he wasn't just searching for survival. He was searching for answers. He was searching for hope. As he descended the building, his eyes caught sight of something else, movement. Not the slow shuffle of the undead, but something quicker, more deliberate. A figure emerged from the shadows, their outline barely visible in the dim light. "Who's there?" Adam called out, his voice firm but cautious. The figure froze, then raised their hands in a gesture of peace. Slowly, they stepped forward, and Adam's heart raced. He hadn't seen another living soul in months. He wasn't sure what to expect. A survivor? Or a threat? The figure emerged from the darkness, a young woman, no older than 25, her face pale but determined. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted, but there was something about her that struck Adam. She wasn't like the other survivors he had encountered before, who were always on edge, always looking over their shoulder. This woman had a calmness about her, a certain resolve. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said quietly, her voice low but steady. "I saw you on the roof. You're not one of them." Adam nodded, still cautious but curious. "I'm not." "Who are you?" "My name is Lily," she replied. "I've been traveling alone for a while now, just trying to find others. I've heard whispers, that there are still pockets of survivors out there. But it's hard to tell who you can trust." Adam's heart skipped a beat. Survivors. There was still hope. She spoke with such certainty, it almost felt too good to be true. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as lost as it seemed. "You've heard of other survivors?" Adam asked, his voice filled with both hope and skepticism. "Where?" Lily shook her head, her expression hardening. I don't know exactly. But I've been following a trail, small signs, messages written on walls, strange markings on the ground. It's like a breadcrumb trail, leading me towards something. I think it's a safe zone, a place where people are trying to rebuild. Adam's mind raced. This could be the break he'd been waiting for. A real safe zone, a place where humanity had begun to fight back. It had to be real. He wasn't about to get his hopes up again, only to be disappointed. I'm going with you, Adam said decisively. I've been looking for something like that for months. If there's a chance to rebuild, I'm not going to let it slip away. Lily's eyes softened, and for the first time since their meeting, she smiled. I thought you might say that. It's not going to be easy, though. The road's dangerous, and we're not the only ones looking for safety. There are others out there, some of them are not friendly. Adam nodded. I've faced worse. They both shared a brief, knowing look. It was clear that neither of them had been spared from the horrors of this new world, and both had learned that survival meant more than just avoiding the dead, it meant navigating a world full of distrust, desperation, and betrayal. With a shared understanding, they turned toward the city's edge, where the factory loomed in the distance. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was the only one they had. The road would be treacherous, filled with dangers both seen and unseen, but Adam felt something stir within him, a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. As they walked side by side, the faintest glimmer of hope began to grow in Adam's heart. The hunger that had once defined the world, the hunger that had destroyed humanity, was now fading. The undead, though not gone, were weakening. And in their place, there was the possibility of something new. A new dawn. A new beginning. Maybe, just maybe, the world could be saved from the depths of its own hunger. Adam wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he had something to hold on to. The hunger that had once threatened to consume everything had started to die. And with it, the promise of life, of rebuilding, began to take root once again. Together, they walked forward, toward the unknown, toward the hope of something better. The sun had begun to rise, casting a soft orange glow across the horizon, lighting up the path ahead. Adam and Lily trudged through the desolate landscape, each step bringing them closer to the rumored safe zone. The factory loomed closer now, its skeletal structure standing tall against the sky, but Adam couldn't shake the unease growing within him. This place, this promise of safety, felt too distant, too unreachable, as though the world had conspired to keep it hidden just beyond their grasp. They hadn't spoken much since they began their journey together, but the silence was comfortable, a shared understanding that both had seen and endured too much to need words. Every now and then, Adam would glance at Lily, noting the weariness in her eyes, the dirt and exhaustion on her face. She was a survivor, just like him, but there was a fragility to her that Adam couldn't ignore. The world had worn them both down, eroded their hope bit by bit. Yet, here they were, still moving forward, still holding on. As they neared the factory, the quiet of the morning was interrupted by a distant sound, the unmistakable groan of the undead. The low growl echoed through the empty streets, a reminder that they were never truly safe. Adam stopped in his tracks, his eyes scanning the area. The groans grew louder, more intense, like a gathering storm. There was something different about the noise this time. It wasn't just the usual aimless wandering of the undead. It sounded organized, like they were moving with purpose. "They're coming," Adam whispered, his voice barely audible in the tense silence. Lily nodded, her face set in grim determination. "We need to get inside, fast. If they've gathered like this, they'll be on us in minutes." Adam's heart pounded as the realization hit him. The undead weren't just wandering anymore. They were grouping together, becoming something more dangerous than they had ever been before. It was as if the fading hunger that had once consumed them was being replaced by something more primal, a survival instinct. The factory's rusted gates were ajar, and Adam wasted no time in pushing them open, signaling for Lily to follow. They hurried inside, the clang of metal echoing in the eerie quiet. The building, once a hub of industry and progress, now stood as a decaying monument to the past, its halls filled with shadows and the distant sound of groaning. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of rot lingered. The factory's massive machinery had long since stopped working, leaving behind only the skeletal remains of its purpose. But this desolation felt like a reprieve, a temporary fortress, even if it was just made of broken steel and shattered glass. Adam and Lily ducked behind a large piece of machinery, trying to steady their breath. They could hear the zombies now, their shuffling footsteps growing closer. The factory's open windows provided little cover, and soon, they would be exposed. The hunger of the undead had subsided, but the danger had not passed. They were still relentless, still searching for something, anything, alive to claim. "We can't stay here long," Adam muttered, his mind racing. "We need a plan." Lily's eyes darted around the factory, scanning for anything that could help them. The answer came to her in an instant, a series of old supply crates stacked near a wall. She turned to Adam with a determined look. "We use the crates. We can climb up to the catwalks above and move across the factory floor." Adam hesitated for a moment, his gaze flicking between Lily and the growing sound of the undead outside. He nodded. "All right. We do it quickly." The two of them scrambled toward the crates, their movements swift and quiet. The undead were now close enough that they could hear their groans reverberating through the walls. Adam's pulse quickened as they climbed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with each step. They reached the catwalk just as the first of the zombies appeared in the factory's entrance. The creatures shuffled forward, their eyes vacant, their bodies decaying and limp. From their vantage point, Adam and Lily could see the full scope of the undead horde. It wasn't just a small group, it was a full-on mass of decaying bodies, all drawn toward the factory, moving with a disturbing sense of unity. They had come for something, but Adam didn't know what. Were they searching for food? Were they gathering for a purpose? The question lingered in his mind as they moved across the catwalk, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The undead below them moved in a slow, methodical pace, as if they were following some unseen signal. It was unnerving. Suddenly, the factory's large metal doors slammed open with a deafening crash, and Adam's stomach dropped. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the factory as a group of armed survivors poured in, soldiers, carrying rifles and wearing grim expressions. They had seen the horde and were not about to let it overrun them. "We've got to hold them off," one of the soldiers shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Adam and Lily exchanged a look. This was it. This was the final stand. They were no longer running. They were facing the end of everything, the end of hope, the end of survival. The undead were closing in on all sides, and the soldiers had little chance of holding them off without help. Without a second thought, Adam grabbed the rifle slung over his shoulder, the weight of it familiar and comforting. "We fight," he said, his voice steady with resolve. Lily nodded. She wasn't afraid. They weren't afraid anymore. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about standing up, about showing the world that even in the face of overwhelming odds, humanity could still fight back. The battle began, the clash of gunfire and the relentless growls of the undead filling the air. Adam and Lily fought side by side, pushing back the horde with everything they had. It wasn't about winning. It was about surviving, about finding the last glimmer of hope in a world that had long since lost its light. And in the end, when the dust settled and the last zombie had fallen, Adam and Lily stood victorious, not because they had defeated the hunger, but because they had embraced it. The hunger for life. The hunger for hope. And with that hunger, they had carved out a place for themselves in this broken world, ready to rebuild from the ashes. In the silence that followed, as the dawn broke over the horizon, Adam looked at Lily, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he smiled. The last bite had never come. But the fight for life had just begun.